Ladies and gentlemen, please be upstanding for the arrival of Her Excellency the Honourable Linda Dessau, Governor of Victoria, and Mr Anthony Howard.
Please be seated. Your Excellency, I invite you to present the honours and awards in the Order of Australia. To be officers in the General Division, Dr. Catherine Elizabeth Grenville, for distinguished service to the literary arts as an author, to the tertiary education sector, to professional societies, and as an advocate for the publishing industry. Professor Bruce Ernest Kemp, for distinguished service to biomedical research, particularly to the study of protein phosphorylation. Dr. Bronwyn King, for distinguished service to community health, particularly through advocacy for institutional investment strategies. Mr. Brian James Lacey, for distinguished service to the public administration of Australia's Indian Ocean Territories, to industrial relations and to the law. Professor Darryl John LeGroux, for distinguished service to education, to research infrastructure development and to architecture. Professor Sharon Ruth Lewin, for distinguished service to medical research and to education in the field of infectious diseases, particularly HIV/AIDS. Mrs. Janet Osborne Lim, for distinguished service to the community through philanthropic support for charitable, social welfare and medical research groups. Emeritus Professor Harold Luntz, for distinguished service to legal education as an academic and editor, to professional development and to the community. Ms. Susan Maslin, for distinguished service to the Australian film industry as a producer and through roles with professional bodies. Professor Katrina Ann McLean, for distinguished service to medicine in the field of academic and clinical neuropathology and as a role model and mentor. Professor John James McNeill, for distinguished service to medicine in the fields of clinical epidemiology and cardiovascular research and to public health. Emeritus Professor Trevor Owen Morgan, for distinguished service to medicine and to medical research in the physiological sciences, particularly in relation to hypertension. Emeritus Professor John Edward Murtagh, for distinguished service to medicine and to medical education in the field of general practice and to professional groups. To be members in the General Division, Professor Mary Pauline Galea, for significant service to medical education in the field of clinical physiotherapy and to professional associations. Ms. Susan Jessica Giles, for significant service to the performing arts as an artistic director and to theatre for children. Mr. Dennis John Goldner, for significant service to the community through charitable, health and cultural organisations. Ms. Sally Lisa Goldner, for significant service to the LGBTIQ community through advocacy roles and to the broadcast media. Mr. Richard Alistair Gower, for significant service to the recreational and historical aviation sector through a range of roles. Mr. Noah David Grace, for significant service to criminal law and to the community through pro bono contributions to sporting bodies. The Reverend Professor Emeritus Robert William Gribben, for significant service to the Uniting Church in Australia, to ecumenical relations and theological studies. Professor John Anthony Griffiths, for significant service to music education as an academic and musicologist and to professional societies. Mrs. Karen Hayes, for significant service to the community as an advocate for gender equity and to women in sport. Mr. William Paul Healy, for significant service to the community, particularly in the area of forensic mental health and to education. Dr. Margaret Elena Hallard, for significant service to medicine as an infectious diseases and public health physician and research scientist. Mr. William Eldred Hennessy, for significant service to music as a concert violinist, artistic director, mentor and educator. Dr. Raymond Eden Holmes, for significant service to surveying and mapping and to professional organisations. Professor Jennifer Frances Hoy, for significant service to medicine and to medical education in the field of infectious diseases. Mr. David Gordon Ingalls, for significant service to the international community through humanitarian medical programs. Dr. William Roy Johnson, for significant service to medicine in the field of endocrinology as an educator and mentor and to surf lifesaving. Mr. Alan Kohler, for significant service to the print and broadcast media as an editor, journalist and finance commentator. Professor Richard Creever, for significant service to legal education, to taxation law and policy reform, and through advisory roles. Dr. Erin Laylaw, for significant service to community health through not-for-profit organisations and to people affected by stroke. Professor John Vance Langmore, for significant service to the Parliament of Australia, to international relations and governance, and to education. Ms. Karen Marie Livingstone, for significant service to community health as an advocate for ovarian cancer research. Mr. Joseph Leo Lakaitis, for significant service to the community through support for medical research and not-for-profit organisations. Ms. Helen Marku, for significant service to music, particularly as a promoter and advocate for live performance. Mr. Ian McLean, for significant service to music, particularly as a promoter and advocate for live performance. Professor Christine Fay MacDonald, for significant service to respiratory and sleep medicine as a clinician researcher, administrator and mentor, and to professional medical organisations. Professor Jennifer Elaine McIntosh, for significant service to medicine, particularly child developmental psychology. Mrs. Jean McLean, for significant service to international relations and to the Parliament of Victoria. Mr. Graham Ross McPherson, for significant service to print and digital media and to the community. To receive the Australian Fire Service Medal for Distinguished Fire Service, Ms. Gwyn Veronica Brennan. Mr. John Thomas Callaghan. Mr. Colin T. Campbell. Ms. Nicole Marie Harvey. Mr. Colin James Newell. Mr. Michael Keith Tisbury. To receive the Ambulance Service Medal for Distinguished Ambulance Service, Mr. David John Booth. Dr. Catherine Jean Eastwood. Mr. Robert John Ferguson. Mrs. Robin Winifred Kelly. Mr. Nicholas Paul Roder. Mr. Ross Allen Salathiel. Miss Catherine Ann Southern. Ms. Therese Francis Toohey. To receive the Medal of the Order of Australia in the General Division, the late Dr. Sally Ann Garrett, to be received by Ms. Emily Mason in recognition of her service to nursing. Mr. Halalul Gubra Selassie for service to the African community of Victoria. Mrs. Glindia Joyce G for service to the community of Kerrang. Mrs. Teree Alice Gordon for service to conservation and the environment. Mrs. Jennifer Margaret Granger for service to the community through charitable organisations. Dr. Jane Helen Greason for service to medicine and to community health. Ms. Heather Margaret Gridley for service to community health. Mrs. Tai B. Ha for service to the Vietnamese community. Mr. Salim Philip Haddad for service to the Lebanese community. Mr. Warwick John Hadfield for service to broadcast media as a journalist. Mrs. Dorothy Evelyn Hamilton for service to music and to people who are blind or have low vision. Mr. Dennis Trigoning Harris for service to surf life saving. Mrs. Gillian Joan Harrison for service to the community through charitable organisations. Dr. Craig Stephen Hassard for service to medicine. Mr. Christopher Neil Hazelman for service to the community of Shepparton. Mr. David Cyril Hazelwood for service to the community through a range of roles. Mr. Alan David Hickling for service to education. Mr. Gary Robert Higgins for service to the community of Maryborough. Dr. Nigel Warren Hocking for service to medicine as a paediatrician. Mr. Robert Henry Holshier for service to the community of Stanhope and District. Dr. Boon Hung Hong for service to community health. Mr. Brian Francis Hopkins for service to print media and to the community. Dr. Donald William Hossack for service to medicine and to the arts. Mr. Desmond Peter Hudson for service to youth. Mr. Jeffrey Drury Hudson for service to youth through Scouts. Mr. John Leonard Hudson for service to the community of Hawthorne. Dr. Bronwyn Eleanor Hughes for service to the visual arts. Mr. Mark David Hunter for service to youth. Ms. Yelena Ilyin for service to the Russian community of Melbourne. Mr. Donald George Jago for service to the community. Dr. Bernard Morris Jenner for service to the community of the Barwon region. Mr. John Graham Jennings for service to community history. Mr. Andrew Frank Jessup for service to the community. Ms. Melanie Jones for service to cricket and to the community. Mr. Craig William Kenny for service to the community. Auntie Diane Kerr for service to the Indigenous community of Victoria. Mrs. Marilyn Dorothea King for service to aged welfare. Dr. Elise Jane Klein for service to the community through a range of social welfare roles. Mr. Robert John Knight for service to the community of Rochester. Mr. Stuart Charles Cole Morgan for service to the community. Mr. Neil Malcolm Lamond for service to tennis. Ms. Prudence Ann Lego for service to women through job readiness initiatives. Mrs. Jennifer Cheryl Lewis for service to children. Mr. Ronald Allen Lewis for service to children. Ms. Fiona Jane Lindsay for service to the community of Denali. Mrs. Sonia Loader for service to youth through Scouts. Mr. Kenneth John Lucas for service to motorsports. Mr. Raymond Henry Luscombe for service to the community of Shepparton. Mr. David Ian McPhail for service to the community through social welfare organisations. Ms. Lee Mackay for service to the Anglican Church of Australia. Mrs. Suzanne Margaret MacLeod for service to the Scottish community of Victoria. Ms. Jessica Mary McPherson for service to the community through the not-for-profit sector. Mrs. Elizabeth Jean Maffei for service to the community of Mildura. The late Dr. Leo Maguire to be received by Mrs. Janice Maguire in recognition of his service to medicine as a chiropractor. Mrs. Gloria May Molseed for service to the community. Mr. John Barry Mulseed, for service to the community. Mr. James Noel Martin, for service to the community through charitable organisations. Mr. John Richard Mason, for service to the community. Ms. Helen Louise Matthews, for service to the law. Mr. Anthony Henry May, for service to the law. Mr. James Charles McCarthy, for service to the community through social welfare organisations. Mr. Robert Bruce McIver, for service to veterans and their families. Mr. John Alfred Mackenzie, for service to the community. Mr. Kelvin George McMeekin, for service to youth through Scouts. Dr. Stanley John Menzies, for service to the communities of South West Victoria. Mrs. Pauline Mary Messenger, for service to the community of Benalla. Mr. Roy Vincent Moriarty, for service to the community through emergency response organisations. Ms. Kristen Ann Will, for service to the legal profession. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please join the Governor and Mr. Howard in congratulating all our recipients. Your Excellency, I now invite you to address us.
Mr Danny Pearson, Parliamentary Secretary to the Premier, representing the Premier, Mr Ken Lay, Lieutenant Governor of Victoria and Chair of Ambulance Victoria, the Honourable Ted Baillieu, former Premier of Victoria, and Mrs Robin Baillieu, Mr Greg Smith, Chair of the CFA, Mr Dan Stevens, Chief Officer and CEO of the MFB, Ms Helene Bender, Chair of the Victorian branch of the Order of Australia Association, ladies and gentlemen, one and all, and of course, above all today, our award recipients. Can I start also by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're gathering today, and by paying my respects to elders past and present, and to the elders who are with us as well. This is truly a wonderful occasion. This ceremony gives each one of us in this magnificent state ballroom, that is our Government House staff and volunteers, as well as our guests and those watching via live stream, a ringside seat from which to view the very best of human endeavour, talent, goodness and kindness. I'm certain that not one of you, our recipients, ever set about your exceptional work in order to be recognised in this way. And many of you will feel humbled, if not downright embarrassed, by all the fuss. But may I tell you, this recognition isn't just praise for the sake of it. It really matters. And it matters because it's a hallmark of a strong nation that we take the time to pause, to recognise and to say a heartfelt thank you to those who've made our community stronger by their excellence and by their very special contributions. And it matters too because we know that when we draw attention to those special contributions, your efforts will inspire others in the process. Some of you have excelled on the international stage, and you've upped Australia's stocks in that global market. Some of you have dedicated yourselves to improving or promoting a particular industry, profession, organisation or activity. Others have operated in a distinct geographical area, the lifeblood of your communities and those around you. Our honours system recognises that full range of contributions and diverse contributors. May I suggest that each one of you, a proven leader in your field or location, is ideally placed to use your sphere of influence to nominate others too who are worthy of recognition, women as well as men, those from the regions as well as the cities, and those from all the different backgrounds that make up our state. We're all the richer when our Australian honours and awards truly represent who we are. I have two other requests of our recipients today. The first is that you wear your medals or pins, not just today, but on a regular basis. Please don't be shy about that. They'll provide an important touch point of inspiration to others. The second request is the most important one that I'll make of you. It's that we ask you today to completely relax. Enjoy the occasion. Enjoy the accolades. Naturally, you feel grateful to your families and your friends and colleagues who've supported you in a myriad of ways, and they're ways that have no doubt helped lead you to this point. Your gratitude, of course, is not misplaced. Not many of us can achieve all alone. But today is very much about you. Don't deflect the glory. Enjoy the praise. Allow us to have the pleasure of thanking you. Thanking you for advancing Australia and thanking you for embodying the Victorian state motto by contributing in all your different ways to our peace and prosperity. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, would you please stand and join heartily in singing the first verse of the Australian National Anthem and remain standing for the departure of the Governor and Mr Howard.